Welcome back, everyone. And if you have not followed us on social media, please do so at Mercycast, almost everywhere, but Facebook, which is just at Mercycast. It really helps when you follow us, you repost what we post, and you let your friends know about this podcast. Thank you so much, really, for joining in on what we're doing here and telling these stories of learning compassion through adversity. Because I think at the end of the day, so much of life can be bound up in it. And we're here to show you that God is doing something new through the pain that you're feeling. With that said, let's dive in. Welcome back to the Mercycast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I am your host, Raleigh Sadler. We talk about compassion a lot. We all want to help our neighbor. But what happens when our well-meaning intentions don't render the right results? What happens when our desires to help people end up hurting them? Throughout Scripture, we see this call to vulnerable populations summarized by 3 words: the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. See, God is not only identifying with these people, He's challenging Israel to join Him. We see the same thing in Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus talks about what you did for the least of these, you did for me. Again, He identifies with those most vulnerable and challenges His people to join Him. But sometimes when we attempt to join Jesus, we don't necessarily approach the situation like He would. Sometimes we can hurt the people we're trying to help. Anne grew up in a home on the front lines of caring for children in a foster system. She also volunteered in orphanages in Mexico. What she saw as a child shaped the adult that she would become and the policymaker that she now is. Today, I am joined by Anne Basham. She is the founder and chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. This is the first global consortium of members of parliament and Congress, governmental leaders, and lived experience experts focusing on educating lawmakers and collaborating on policy solutions to address modern slavery. She is also the CEO of Ascend Consulting, a human rights advocacy firm based in Washington, D.C. Anne, welcome to the Mercycast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So recently, I've been in the United Kingdom and other places in the United States talking with leaders about how we can push back on modern-day slavery and how we can care for our most vulnerable neighbor. And Anne, what is interesting to me is that you keep coming up in all of these conversations. So I'm glad to be talking to you. I feel like everyone I've been talking to knows you. And so I'm glad to have you on this episode.
Oh, I am so glad to be here. Yeah, I dabble in a lot of things. If it has to do with human trafficking and stopping that, especially at the policy level, I am there.
And so where did this passion to influence policy come from?
Well, I lived outside of Washington, D.C. as a kid. So I did see firsthand that what happens in Washington impacts the whole world. And so I really have this deep-seated belief that when you change laws, you change lives. Ooh. And if we look at William Wilberforce, William Wilberforce ended the transatlantic slave crisis, or ushered in the end of the transatlantic slave crisis in the 1800s because of a parliamentary campaign. Parliament is a very fancy word for Congress. And so basically it was through a lawmaking campaign, and it took about 30 years. And the UK became the first, and, the rest is history, as they say. But it started with a law. And so I really believe that we can have all the best efforts in the world to stop trafficking and child abuse and domestic violence and all these other very, very heavy topics. But most people want to just work on the recovery and the restoration side of it. And that is really important. I believe that's vitally important. Like you said, my parents were foster parents to numerous kids when I was there. They were on that restorative care side. But what I see is that to a large extent, that's playing whack-a-mole. When I worked at the Department of Justice, and I just kept thinking, I want to make sure that this never happens to anyone. So anyway, that's how I got involved in the policy side, because I see it as the best form of prevention.
And so many people who are impacted by global injustices like human trafficking are in places where there is either no rule of law or the law is not properly enforced. So with you coming and saying, no, we need to speak to policymakers, we need to speak to lawmakers and get these things on the books so that people can be brought to account and people can be protected. Because if there's no infrastructure for this, people will fall by the wayside. Do you agree? Disagree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's not exciting to talk about laws or legislation or policy, but it makes the biggest difference.
Well, and oftentimes for Christians, they want to vote with their conscience. And I think as you're thinking through policies and showing how these policies ultimately impact those most vulnerable, that actually includes every one of our listeners to use their power as they visit the ballots to say, okay, how am I voting in such a way where I can care for my most vulnerable neighbor? And these are policies that oftentimes aren't talked about, at least at a popular level. I know people like you are talking about them and you are ringing this bell and you were saying, everyone look, but some of us may not even be aware that there are policies like this in place, or there are policies that are being voted on right now that can impact people who could fall prey to the lures of traffickers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, voting and making sure that those who are your elected officials is huge. You know, I got my start fresh out of college working on Capitol Hill, and I saw firsthand that when people contact their member of Congress, that counts as a vote behind the scenes. I mean, they are elected officials. And so, your emails, your phone calls, your meetings with them, believe it or not, you can take meetings with staff, it all counts. And so I really believe in that. I really believe in voting. I believe in contacting your members of Congress because it does make a difference.
It's been exciting for me recently to see elected representatives really stand up for those most vulnerable and to know about issues like human trafficking in a deep way, not as just a political chess piece, but as something that they are very passionate about. Recently, I was just in North Carolina where I had the opportunity to speak for State Senator Ted Alexander. Senator Alexander is a passionate man who is really working hard to turn the tide of human trafficking in his own state. He is saying, not on my watch. He does not like that this is happening in his community, and he's doing something about it. And part of what he's doing is working to see policies changed. How are you connected with people like Senator Alexander in working to change policies?
That's a great question. Well, I actually met him because I was speaking at, I might get the name wrong, but the National Christian Lawmakers Association at their conference about a policy regarding child protection. So it was a room full of state lawmakers who are Christians and prioritize this all around the country. And we chatted afterward, and he said, why don't you come down to North Carolina? So I came down and was able to educate other lawmakers and policymakers within North Carolina about this. But I really believe everything starts with education. So really educating lawmakers on, hey, there's a problem that you don't know about, because that's where it starts. And then second to that, a lot of the policies that I've developed have really been founded in prayer. Just me being upset about something internally and thinking, like so many of us do, this is so frustrating, something in the news, something that's an injustice that's happened that we've heard of within not even necessarily in our families, but maybe a neighbor or someone else. And so it just starts with prayer. And then all of a sudden, sometimes it's years later, for me, it turns into a policy. What can I do about it? Maybe I can change policy or change a law to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else.
So your holy discontent leads you to prayer. I think sometimes when we feel this righteous anger, sometimes we do the first thing that comes to mind, which in my estimation is always the worst thing. It's just us reacting without a plan. But I love how you said, no, this thing irritates me. This thing frustrates me. And then I go to God about it and I start talking to him, and that shapes what I will do next. And as you are someone who is passionate about policy, it comes out in that way. How has prayer historically shaped your policy making?
It's at the root of all of it. So I will tell you, for me, it all starts with a frustration or an irritation. I always think of it like pearls. Pearls
Yeah.
are because of an irritation. Sand irritates them and it turns into something beautiful. And for me, it starts with a wrestling in prayer. I prayed for a woman in Sudan who I didn't know, who was caught in a prison cell in 2014 on death row for her faith. And I remember I had little kids at the time. I was waking up in the middle of the night for those reasons and couldn't go back to sleep. And so I would pray for her because that was what I thought, if I'm up, I'm going to pray for someone. And that happened time and time again. And do you know, years later, that woman is Miriam Ibrahim. She got out of prison. She ended up in my state. And there's a whole story that we don't have time for here. She is a dear friend of mine. And we've been able to do policy work together. And, but it started with a prayer. It literally started with a prayer. There's another policy that I developed. It had to do with a child. And she, it was a situation where actually the dad had committed a form of abuse against her. It was more physical abuse. Her mother, she reported it. The counselor reported it. CPS came out. Long story short, she told the truth. She told the testimony, which is very hard for children to do. And the story was not recorded accurately. It was recorded inaccurately.
Oh, man.
Because of that, justice wasn't served. And that came to my attention. I've actually read the report, so I can verify it. And it was written down inaccurately the second time. Anyway, so because of that, I sat there in prayer for a long time. I mean, months, saying, I cannot get this out of my head. And one day I was in my quiet time in the morning, and I just said to the Lord, I got to let this go. My prayer today is I want to let this go. I got to move on. And this little thought crossed my mind back, what would have changed? And so I thought about it and I thought, okay, what would have changed this scenario is if there had been a recording. If this little girl had had her interview recorded, everything would have changed because the CPS caseworker would have had to write down the truth about her story because there would have been a recording as a form of accountability. So this thought crossed my mind, why don't you do that? Why don't you, Anne, do that? And so this was over 5 years ago. I set out to do just that. And now I am so excited to say one of the organizations I partner with is Street Grace, Christian organization. And they have partnered with me to advance this policy in Arizona with unanimous consent in January, passed it through the House committee, and it may become law in Arizona and other states now, so that every child testimony is recorded by CPS to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But it wouldn't have happened had I not prayed about it. You know what I mean? And taken this serious irritation, when I'm putting that mildly, it was more than an irritation, turned it to God and said, what do I do? And he threw it back to me, so to speak, with his help and said, let's turn it into a policy.
Some people will see an irritation and they will just think through a political lens. We have to impact policy. Other people will see it through a philosophical or spiritual lens and say, we just need to pray about this. But I love how holistic your approach is. You're saying, no, I'm called to love my neighbor. Here are some ways that I can love my neighbor. I can love my neighbor by casting light on darkness that is there, that is ultimately rendering them more susceptible to exploitation. Just what you said about how you saw that, if we're able to actually record these conversations, then people will not be able to get them wrong because that will now be on the record and people will be able to take someone's notes and compare them with the recording. I think that's a wonderful way to advocate for your vulnerable neighbor. And I think a lot of us, we're trying to think through, how do we advocate for other people? How do we care for other people? And your own story is telling us that there's a myriad of ways. We are all created with different passions and concerns that are on our hearts. And I think God is passionate about us connecting to his passion for those most vulnerable, the way that we are made. And so with you doing this policy piece, I love it because my brain doesn't even work like that. I'm not thinking policy. I'm more thinking, how do I help churches care for the people in their community? And you're thinking, how do I help people in their community, churches included, think rightly about policies so that people will be protected. How would you encourage people who they're thinking through, like, what does it mean for me to care for someone who's vulnerable?
Yeah, I think I love that analogy because it translates different for everyone. You know, years ago, I was actually a teen and I read a book called Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby.
Hmm.
Not an endorsement for or against it, but it changed my life because it made me realize, oh, I really can lean into this idea that God is a real being who wants to have a relationship with us. And the whole premise of it is to join God in what he's doing, not to just decide, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z for God. And so I really believe that everything, is moving around us. And so one of the things that James 1:27, for example, everyone knows this verse. It's care for the widows and the orphans and keep yourself unpolluted from the world. Well, that verse gets translated a million different ways. So when I was a kid, for example, my parents, well-meaning, our church, well-meaning, sent me as a teen and many other teens off to an orphanage in Mexico. And we washed lice out of kids' hair, we painted, we did projects, and we loved on these kids. They said, be friendly with the kids, find someone. I took photos with them. We were encouraged to do that. And literally in my adult life, I had someone say to me, do you know that there's such a thing as orphanage trafficking? I said, I've never heard of this. And when I started leaning into it, it was someone who actually was working for a Christian organization. And she said, do you realize that one of some of the most well-meaning people in the world are the ones who fall victim to it? And I said, how is that? And they said, because they don't know any better. And here I thought I was doing this wonderful thing, helping orphans. And it turns out, she said, these kids, it's true. People who were there, here, think of a row of strangers coming in and out every single week, and you have no parents, and you bond with someone and then they leave. And so it creates this cycle in their brain of, you know what I mean? Those who come in don't stay. And so anyway, I realized that some orphanages I do believe are well-meaning, but not every orphanage out there is well-meaning. And many of them are doing this for profit. In fact, they say there are 8 million orphans, quote, in the world today, but 80% of them actually have a parent or a caregiver or a family member who's alive who could care for them with just a minimal level of support, but they don't. And so it's too much for this podcast today, but I will tell you, it flipped my world on its head because I thought, how could this be? I was so well-meaning. We were so well-meaning, but now I know better. And so one of the things that I advocate for now, policy-wise, is foster care. I think it's one of the best ways that the church can get involved is to provide loving homes for vulnerable children, and then internationally to help organizations that provide foster care, literal foster care, and those who are part of the process of transitioning countries into foster care. So that's just one example of policy and how my faith has shaped it.
Well, let's sit there for a minute because this idea of orphanage trafficking should shake us to our cores. We think that, yes, we're going to help people. And when we go to that orphanage on a mission trip and we're caring for people in that children's home, that all of those kids are there for the right reasons. But one thing I've noticed in my work is that sometimes these are kids taken from nearby villages who have families who are exploited, and there's a trafficking situation. We don't always know. And I think it's very important for us to understand that we think we might be doing a good thing when there are exploiters on the other side who are exploiting us for our money. They're exploiting us for more just clout, what have you. And I really want to know, how has your desire to shape policy been applied to this issue of orphanage trafficking?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I founded a group called the Inter-Parliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. We started a working group on it when this came to my attention. So now we have a whole working group on it. You can find it online. I don't know if you have a link in your thing, but you go to Inter-Parliamentary Task Force, or you go to taskforceonht.org, and you just click on one of the tabs. It will pull up the whole thing and you can watch a little video about it, all of that. But last October, our working group, one of the main members, which is Senator Reynolds from Australia, their country is a member of the IPU, which is a huge governing body of about 172 nations. She went to their annual conference and she put forth a resolution on orphanage trafficking to lawmakers from throughout the world, basically educating them, saying, this is what it is, this is how it happens, and you can do something about it. You can put laws in place that prevent what we call voluntourism, is where orphanages actually make money on bringing and recruiting volunteers to come through, but also false adoptions, meaning that there are children who are not truly orphans, whose parents have either the children, in some cases we've heard of, been straight kidnapped, but in other cases, more likely the parents were defrauded and they thought their child was going to a boarding school or getting a better life or something like that. And turns out their child was actually being taken to an orphanage. So now there's a resolution, first global one of its kind, as of October on this. And you can read it right there on the website. But that's just one thing we're doing. We're looking to elevate it to the UN as well, so that it's recognized in law. But this is something that is a modern form of trafficking that most people don't know about, directly intersects the American church specifically, and really through deception, which is at the core of all trafficking. It's deceiving very well-meaning people who want to do a good thing and care for vulnerable children and honor James 1:27, and in the process are actually feeding into a very, very dark and corrupt system.
Well, and this is so scary because, like you said, we're just trying to do a good thing and we're working with the cards that we're dealt. We are told that if we partner with these organizations, then we're going to be able to affect change. And for us, children's homes or what used to be called orphanages, they are sacred, but they're not all safe. And as you talk about these ideas of false adoptions and voluntourism, how can we recognize that? How can we tell the difference?
That is a really great question. Well, first of all, I think at the US level, because this is a US audience, I think that for the most part, it starts with being very careful if you're even considering an international adoption. At the core of all of this is actually a lot of international adoptions. It's a primary way that they make their money. So I'll give you an example. In Uganda, this is a real case. And there was a Christian mother who adopted a child from Uganda and found out later that actually that child had a mother and a family in Uganda. And it had been falsified. A lot of these people can't even read. So she had put a fingerprint. A fingerprint is a signature on the document and had no idea that her child was going to be in that situation. Fortunately, the FBI, State Department are onto this. They are aware of it and actually have been proactive in helping. So that's one way. The other way would be to encourage and support organizations internationally that provide foster care and loving homes. So my big belief is that at the core, we should work towards what I call deinstitutionalization. So I understand that right now, kids need to be safe. It doesn't happen in a minute. But there's a reason why in the United States, we have foster care instead of orphanages now. And ultimately, the goal is to be able to provide safe, loving homes for children versus putting them into institutions, which is really where a lot of this starts. So those are two things, just to be careful where your money goes. The third thing is if you travel specifically to countries like Africa or parts of Southeast Asia, Cambodia. I know not everyone goes there, but sometimes people go there and they're on vacation. Believe it or not, cruise ships will even go to places and they'll advertise as one of the activities that, people can do voluntourism. You can go to an orphanage for the day. Please do not do that. Please do not go to an orphanage for the day. It causes trauma to the children and it's not helpful, but that is not something that anyone should be participating in, nor is it helpful.
Help us understand how something like that could be so well-meaning could cause trauma.
So when it comes to voluntourism, for example, it's giving them money. So you're giving money to orphanages and basically paying them to interact with children. But these are children who have lost their parents or they think they've lost their parents and they have high trauma. And now you're engaging with them and they're never going to see you again. You're taking a photo with them. And I hate to say it makes it like a zoo, but really it treats children like it's a zoo. And think about it. It's not someone coming into your home for the day to meet your child. This isn't a loving family home. This is an institution. These are children who have experienced extreme trauma in many cases. And then a constant barrage of strangers coming in isn't helpful. And it's an industry. It's a business at the end of the day that you're feeding into. And that's not what we want to be doing, obviously.
Well, there's been a move, especially in evangelical circles, but I would say in almost every denomination, of short-term mission trips. And I'm not 100% against short-term mission trips, but when I lead them, for me, it's always about equipping someone to go back home. It's way more about equipping them to go back home, building relationships that are healthy and doing the work back home, rather than them going to another location and being the answer to the problems there. As I work with students that'll come to New York to learn about human trafficking, I'll say, this isn't about you coming to save New York. Actually, this is completely different. This is about New York maybe helping to save you and maybe helping to help you think differently about your neighbors back home. And how can we, as we go on these short-term mission trips, do it in a way where we're not just doing it for, I hate to say it, but it's almost this spiritual entertainment, this desire to feel like we're doing something good so that our messianic complexes are boosted. How can we do short-term mission trips well in light of what you're telling us?
That is such a great question. Well, I'm not an expert in short-term missions trips. I have done them, but I will tell you this. When it comes to loving our neighbor, vulnerable children should be a huge factor in the consideration of that. So, for example, I would not have participated if someone had done the screening process like, hey, you're going on a short-term missions trip. Is the goal for you to interact with vulnerable children? There's a big pause for me in that, because what we want to make sure is that we are not doing more harm than good.
That's right.
And that's really what it comes down to, is we want to make sure that we're not unintentionally causing harm. And that happens all the time with well-meaning people here in the United States too, who want to do something good. They're not really informed. And so they actually can cause harm and additional trauma. The other thing is, I always tell people, check your motives. Like, I know I'm a parent too. I have teens, but it's great for our teens to go to other countries, but let's make sure we're not doing it, just so that our teen has this great experience in a third world country. We want to make sure that our motives are right in sending our own teens or others to other nations. You know what I mean?
I used to, right after seminary, I got a job at a children's home who I believe was an orphanage and had been around for like 150 years. And I was working at this place. And one thing I noticed was, yes, people would be excited about just doing one-off visits. But what we were trying to do, and we were actually doing this with intention, it was from the top down, I believe. We were trying to find people in churches who actually wanted to spend time and dedicate time on a weekly basis with some of the people who were in this home, because we wanted these children to experience community. Now, we didn't want people to just come in, check that off the box and leave. We're saying, okay, do you want to have a relationship with someone that might end up in fostering? And what I found is sometimes that's harder to get people to do, because you have to be bought in. And when you are actually committing to befriending and getting to know your vulnerable neighbor, that's not as easy as just saying hi or standing behind a line at a soup kitchen. It's actually engaging someone and dealing with the stuff that they bring to the table, and then dealing with your own stuff as that comes up. And I think that's what love really looks like. It's a commitment. It's a choice. It's saying, yeah, it got weird today, but I'm going to come back this week and we're going to keep talking, and I'm not going to walk away as long as it's healthy, And so, yeah, I think that's something that I would love to see churches do, is make commitments to vulnerable people. Because yes, we're all in agreement that children should not be trafficked. But when our desire to help them actually puts them in more danger, we have to rethink that. And I think if we choose to commit our time, that could be a better way to go forward. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a really good point too, is the long term. There are people who are dedicating long term commitments internationally and here in the United States. And I work with a lot of these nonprofits. There are some really excellent nonprofits out there, and they're underfunded. And so I know it doesn't feel as good to give, $10, $100 or more to these organizations, but oftentimes I think that they could use that money so much more. That $3,000 that you were going to spend going there would go much further towards supporting those who are actually living over there. Like you said, long-term investing in whole communities.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned that there seems to be a move from group homes to more of a fostering focus. This is something I feel like I've been seeing recently, is there are less children's homes and more fostering opportunities. Am I just seeing things, or are we saying the same thing here?
So, there's a number of organizations who have started focusing on it. It's focused on a lot at the policy level too, really because we realized here in the United States, we don't have a lot of group homes anymore. And they've even started with the Family First Act. Just a few years ago in policy, one of the things that did was limit the size of foster homes or group homes here in the United States. And the reason for that is because it's a lot harder to hold them accountable. Also, if you go watch the video on our website, there's a really excellent story told by a lived experience expert in Uganda. He's a wonderful Christian man, or Kenya, I should say. And he has this line in there where he says, institution is not a home. And he grew up in one. And I think at the end of the day, everyone wants children to be safe, but the best place for a child is in a home. And there are a lot of impoverished communities who are putting their children into orphanages because they don't have the funds, or they think they're going to give their kids a better life. And so I think that's where the move comes from, is wanting to keep kids truly, truly safe. There's an organization called Lumos. You can go, this is all they do is talk about this issue, but there are a lot of organizations and some organizations that actually help group homes to transition into more of a foster care setting. So I know I could dive into this for a long time, but one of the members of our orphanage trafficking group, she got into this issue with that. If you go to our page, she did a whole TED talk on it. She was all ready to start her own group home in Cambodia and tells the story of why she went a completely different direction with it. And so I think that's really, it's kind of flipping things on its head and being open as a Christian to saying, hey, the things I thought I knew, maybe I have to rethink a little bit. And it's hard to rethink, but sometimes we have to rethink how we're applying scripture to our lives.
And I think we're constantly growing. And oftentimes we can have these things that have become sacred, but we have forgotten to challenge them. Some of these ideas may not translate to today's culture. And as you even talk about fostering has become something that is very important in evangelical circles. And many people are fostering to adopt. And I think with this apparent decline in group homes, where does fostering give way to family reunification?
Wow, that is a great question. I believe the very, very short answer to that is that foster care should be rare and brief. I didn't coin that phrase. It's pretty well known throughout the foster care space, but most people who work in this space would say the same thing, is that at the end of the day, children want to be with their family of origin. I just want to give a couple statistics so that people know. Most children, this is in the United States, most children who are in foster care are not there because of abuse. They're there because of neglect. And sometimes that neglect is not true neglect. Sometimes it's poverty. And so I think when you wrap your mind around that most of foster care is not abuse. I'm not talking about kids no one would argue that a child who has been abused should be in foster care. But for a large majority of them, that's not the case. And so what we really want to focus on is making sure that that reunification process happens as quickly as possible. There are a number of policies that can happen, and that removals are as rare as possible. That's a whole nother policy issue, but that gets to the root of that policy that I mentioned earlier, really wanting to make sure that every child's testimony is recorded, that if they say something, that their voice is heard. Because otherwise, if you say something and you're a child, guess what? You're voiceless unless an adult gives you a voice. That's the truth. So in the United States, what happens is that a report of abuse or neglect happens. Someone calls CPS. CPS shows up at the child's school. 37.4% of kids in the United States have been interviewed by CPS at some point before they're 18. This is over a third of American kids. They're pulled out of the classroom. They're taken into a room by themselves with a stranger. This is all 50
Right.
how it works. By themselves. There's usually no one else in the room. And guess what? There's not a recording of any of them in most cases. It's just a written testimony that the CPS caseworker makes to the best of their knowledge based on what the child has said. Now, if the child tells something and the CPS caseworker chooses not to write it down, guess what? That child's testimony, there's no voice. There's no voice. If the child doesn't, do you know what I mean? There's all sorts of scenarios. So that's where I really believe at the end of the day, there can be removals that are unnecessary or removals that possibly should happen, in some cases because of testimony. But that gets to the heart of it. So anyway, it's a whole big topic, but at the end of the day, what we really want is for foster care to be rare and brief, because every child at the end of the day usually wants to be with their parents in most situations.
I've researched the Christian social action movement of the early 1900s in New York, and there were some good things that happened with it. There were some things that weren't so great. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating is here were organizations, churches in many cases, working with vulnerable adults. And one of the things, even with vulnerable adults, if they were on the street, say in Hell's Kitchen, New York, one of the first things they would do is say, do you have any living family members? Anyone that we can reconnect you with? Because even then, they understood that there is something sacred about this idea of reunification, even if that's adult to family members. And so how much more powerful would it be for children who are longing to be with the people that they've known the longest, the people that they may see as safe people, even if those people in those moments aren't safe because of various forms of neglect. And I think this gives us an opportunity to view discipleship even differently as something where we can take families along and say, what does it look like to live in healthy relationship with God and each other? How do you parent well? How do you work well? How do you serve your children? And how do you see your children as people who have a voice? You mentioned how we should listen to children. And I think when people say, I want to be there, I want to be a voice for the voiceless, I kind of think that's a misnomer. Because I think there are people out there and they have voices. Oftentimes, we're just talking too loudly. And so what it sounds like with what you're doing is you're saying, no, people, let's come together. Let's focus on this problem. Let's see the faces of the people that we're trying to help, because this isn't some dry policy. This is something that if we actually put our hearts behind this, lives will change, because we are breaking bonds that have held people susceptible to exploitation for far too long. And so, Anne, in these final moments, how would you encourage people that want to do charity, but to do it in a healthy way?
Great question. Do your research. I think that would be the biggest thing. So it looks different. I know it's basic, but do your research, really get educated on it. And I always start again with prayer. I believe so strongly, if you're moved to compassion for something, pray into it and really try to discern how you should engage on this issue. I could give story after story of things I have avoided because literally promptings or information that suddenly was very well timed and happened to cross my path. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to make a different decision, And so that's listening. A lot of times it's not a lightning, it's definitely not a lightning bolt or, that sort of thing, but it's just new information. I often pray, please, Lord, bring stuff across my path that I need to know. Give me wisdom. There's a great verse in the Bible that says, if you ask for wisdom, God will give it to you generously. So I think if you want to be involved in charity, start by asking for wisdom on the topic, not just saying, what will I do for God? But saying, God, what can I do to serve you? I have a heart for this. And then wait to see what unfolds. It's going to look different for each person on this than it is for me. And that's the great part about it.
Earlier, you mentioned Henry Blackaby, who said, if you want to find the will of God, find where God is at work and join him there. And I like to push that just a tiny bit to say, if you want to find where God is at work, find those most vulnerable, those who are in your path, those who are in your sphere of influence, and start a conversation or learn about them and see what it could look like for you to engage. You may not be coming in as a hero, and I think that's okay, because I'm not sure God calls us to be heroes, but I do know that he calls us to be neighbors. And so what does it look like to be a neighbor to these people? And you tell us, research the issue, learn. I love your focus on education. You talk about having wisdom and then waiting for what unfolds. Oh my gosh, I could not agree more, because when we get that irritation that you talked about earlier, we want that irritation to go away and we just react. And you're saying, no, let's be proactive. Let's learn. Let's take a moment. And then let's try to react in the healthiest way. You've given us so much to think about. And I really appreciate you being on the Mercycast today.
I appreciate it too. And thank you for what you're doing. Make disciples. That's it at the end of the day. It's not make heroes. It's not be a hero. It's make disciples.
That's right.
So that's the Great Commission in a nutshell.
That's right.